Good night, everyone joining the live for my very first episode of my book club, my virtual book club. We're gonna be reading A Radical Awakening by Dr. Shefali. So Dr. Shefali Tsabry, a psychologist of how many years, and she has written this wonderful book called The Radical Awakening: Turn Pain into Power, Embrace Your Truth, and Live Free. So I'm going to start first with her poem, The Time of an Awakened Woman. There comes a time in the life of a woman when she discards her old ways like tossed shoes in the garbage, when she shreds her list of shoulds and obligations, and when impossible expectations are burned in an incinerator. There comes a time in the life of a woman when the approval of others, once jewels, now turn to pennies in her sock. When the hunt for another is now replaced by hunt for herself, and when parental tentacles of tradition no longer define her truth. There comes a time in the life of a woman when her desire to fit in with the crowd dissolves, when her manic compulsion to be perfect vaporizes, and when her obsession to be voted popular eviscerates. There comes a time in the life of a woman when she simply says no more, when facade, artifice, and guile leave her nauseated, and when righteousness, dogma, and superiority repulses her. There comes a time in the life of a woman when she no longer fears conflict, but faces it boldly like a lioness, when she guards her authenticity as fearlessly as she guards her babies, and when she drops the role of savior, knowing that she can only save herself. There comes a time in the life of a woman when she no longer cowers in the shadows of her unworthiness, when she no longer plays small so others can feel big, when she swaps the role of a victim for the role of co-creator. There comes a time in the life of a woman when she unabashedly and boldly occupies her ultimate sovereignty, when she finally feels ready to claim her space in the world, and when she redefines compassion as unequivocal self-love. There comes a time in the life of a woman when she finally releases her childlike dependencies on others, when she dares to rewrite a new mandate of living for herself, one that says, I release unworthiness and fear, I divorce civility and passivity, I divest in authenticity and enmeshment, I end the pretense of being someone I am not, and from now on I declare, I will ascend into my highest power. I will embrace my autonomy. I will celebrate my deepest worth. I will embody my fiercest courage and manifest the most authentic me. The time is now. I am ready to awaken into my renaissance. So the first chapter of the book starts in part 1, Asleep in the Matrix. Soul Erosion, Chapter 1. Like a sword in a sheath, her brilliance stays dormant. Like a bow in a quiver, her power stays invisible. Like a pea in a pod, her worth stays small. Like a trapped animal in a cage, she awaits permission to be freed. Like a butterfly in formation, she will only emerge when her old skin dies. I knew I was in trouble when I found myself in a ditch on the side of the road with zero recollection of how I got there. I had fallen asleep at the wheel and my car had stopped inches from a tree. Exhausted from mothering my toddler and coping with a rigorous PhD program in tandem without any help from relatives or nannies, I had burned myself to the ground. The jolt woke me up. I could barely breathe and my entire body was shaking, jittery and confused. I was luckily able to get my car back onto the highway. Thankfully, there was no injury to anyone. Even my vehicle was undamaged. The incident brought to the fore another kind of casualty that had been eroding me from within for a long time: the serious destruction I had been doing to my soul. Soul erosion is a gradual process, a slow, creeping, chipping away of our inner being, resulting in the inevitable death of all we know to be our true selves. It's a disease that begins in childhood and spreads contagiously, especially in women. Its symptoms include loss of power, loss of authenticity, loss of voice, and loss of vision. Soul erosion is essentially is an obliteration of our inner knowing. Each incident in which we suppress our inner truth, we engage in the erosion of our most precious treasure, our essence. Let me illustrate how this happens. Trista, one of my clients, remembers being around 4 years old when she broke her favorite toy, a doll she had named after herself and took care of it like it was her little baby. Heartbroken, she recalls crying for hours. Her father, a strict disciplinarian, told her to stop crying or else she would get a spanking. This made her cry even more. When she continued crying at the dinner table, her father lost his temper, broke the rest of her doll, and dumped it in the garbage. Shocked by his rage, Trista recalls being stupefied. It was like he had broken me into pieces and dumped me in the garbage. I wanted to cry and scream. I actually wanted to hit him and break him, but instead I just stood there, frozen. No one came to my rescue. No one comforted me. For the first time, I realized what it meant to be abandoned. He didn't just throw my precious doll away, he discarded my entire sense of safety, security, and worth. I could never trust him or my mother in the same way again. From that moment, it dawned on her that she needed to hide her true self. This is how her lifetime armor of emotional stoicism formed. To this day, even in her 40s, Trista has a challenging time expressing her inner world and feelings articulately. Both her husband and children often complain to her that they don't feel connected to her because she's too harsh and rigid. Her teenage son, Matt, in particular, had been entering into almost daily conflicts with her, which led her to seek therapy with me. It was only after much processing that she came to understand how her childhood defenses, emotional withdrawal, and suppression were now interfering with her ability to connect with her son. Trista was repeating her childhood pattern to the letter, even personifying some of her father's old ways. When Matt expressed his feelings, Trista found herself being critical and harsh with him. Now she understood why. He reminded her of her younger self, the one who was reprimanded by her father. When she saw him being emotional, she interpreted it as a weakness and sought to squash his feelings, invalidating him just as she had been. As she brought her own memories into awareness, she began to heal the wounds of her old self, and in this way opened her heart to her son. At first, our true self fights for survival. It protests loudly, so much that we feel nauseated. As we continue to ignore it, the protesting fades until it's a mere whimper. As the years erase all memory of its existence, the plaintive cries recede altogether. This loss of self is universal. We have all felt its ravaging wounds. As our authenticity erodes, what's left behind is a cavernous inner crater filled with a cacophony of chaos that infects every part of how we now live. It manifests in all sorts of insidious and seemingly insignificant ways. Cars careening off roads, alcoholic blackouts, eating disorders, chronic exhaustion, self doubt and sabotage, purposeless jobs, missed deadlines, forgotten bills, listlessness and apathy, confusion and self loathing, emotional disconnection and withdrawal, gnawing anger and irritability, and so much more. My near death accident shook me into the awareness that not only had I veered off the road, I had veered off my soul's reason for being here. Who was I? Who had I become in the flurry of gaining my PhD while trying to be a wife and a mother? How had I allowed my essence to be destroyed and discarded in this way? I was so good at hiding my inner life that no one would know. I was emotionally disjointed and falling apart. My veneer of competence was brilliantly put together, covering my internal disarray and misalignment. I wore a mask of super competence and achievement. After all, I had been creating this outer persona for decades and it was now well honed. As it is with all of us, the death of who we originally are is replaced by a persona we commonly call the ego, our false self. Most of us grew up thinking of this as our true self. Little do we realize that we are creating an entire self, an entire life based on a false foundation that will have severe emotional consequences for years to come. The role of the ego. The birthplace of the ego is self abnegation. It thrives when the inner self is ignored, denied, suppressed, and all but annihilated in favor of a force on the outside, typically the voice of others, especially our loved ones, the culture in which we are raised, or a system of beliefs that captures our imagination. There isn't a person I know who has escaped the replacement of their authentic self with a persona, the mask behind which their true self lies largely dormant. This happens more so with little girls because of the overarching patriarchy we live under, where boys are allowed to just be boys. Our young girls, on the other hand, are trained to fit a rigid prescription early in life. So conditioned are women to abandon any vestige of inner truth for the sake of fitting into what our parents or culture want for us that we go through life unaware such a split even exists. Sometimes we may feel a rumbling within that shows up as a disconnect or discontent or flares of anger, but we downplay these as moods or attribute them to some issue that ruffled our feathers. We bypass our inner schism, unaware that it is creating deep crevices in our life. Most of us grow into adults unaware of the false ways we have adopted in order to get our needs for love met and our worth met. If we happen to be shaken awake, as I was when my car left the road, we typically run for cover. Before long, recycling our old way of being. Things stay much the same under the guise of good enough. With this in mind, you may be surprised to hear that the facade we refer to as the ego is actually a good guy. The ego is a picture we carry of ourselves in our head, a way of seeing ourselves that meshes well with what our family and society expects of us. Having developed slowly in response to our upbringing, it cleverly teaches us a way of functioning that suits our everyday reality. As children, we were unable to self advocate. Growing up, we had no option but to surrender to the conditioning we received, even if this meant a divorce from our essence. By creating a false self, the ego is, in fact, acting compassionately. As a necessary aspect of what it takes to grow up, the false self is something we instinctively adopt in order to ensure our needs get met. The tricky thing about the ego is that its coup of who we really are, in essence, is so gradual that we aren't aware of how it's changing us to fit in with our family and culture. Moldable as children are we capitulate to our parents' dictates, often without pushback. We contort ourselves until we match the picture others have of such that their picture of us becomes our own picture. If our parents admonished us for being too emotional or too this or too that, many of us immediately reacted to their injunctions in some rapid fire way, adjusting our temperaments to match their standards. As happened with Trista, The ego becomes our armor, our protector, helping us to adjust to a misaligned childhood. So great is our thirst to be seen and validated by our parents and our culture that we succumb to the ego's powerful and instinctive lure, slowly burying our authentic nature in the process. We result in a false identity, which we now present to the world. We think it's who we are, but it's really only a facade we wear to ward off the fear that we are unworthy and unlovable. In the fog. I can honestly say that I lived in the fog for much of my life. There were glimpses of my authentic self here and there, of course, but there were large parts of myself that stayed submerged for decades. Looking back at who I used to be, I cannot help but wonder how, when I felt emotionally invalidated or subjugated, I simply silenced myself. The woman I am today would never allow that to happen. Yet this same woman not only allowed it in the past, she rationalized it as her only choice. This is what I mean by being in a fog. The fog is an atmosphere that surrounds us, whether we are women or men. The fog produces vision blindness and results in a denial of a reality. We don't see things as they actually are. This atmosphere is created by what we know as the patriarchy. The system of male domination brings with it an implicit silencing and denigration of women and children. The male, who is accustomed to being at the top of the totem pole, exerts his power over others to maintain command. This hierarchy has the potential to turn toxic when left unchecked, referred to as toxic masculinity. It becomes the ambient cultural tone, leaving its emotional scars on both women and men. Quite simply, it fogs our lens of consciousness, causing severe dysfunction in our lives. As a result, women and children live in a subconscious state of wariness around men. We grow up knowing men are in charge. With this comes the awareness that there's a potential threat when we are around them. Every female instinctively knows to turn away from a group of men in an alley. The instinct isn't mere paranoia. It is an inner caution honed by strong cultural evidence of innumerable violations against us. Although protective, it's a burden that is too heavy to bear. Can you imagine how this awareness of a potential threat shapes our psyche? Whether we had a father who simply raised his voice occasionally or one who indulged in mad rages, we learn to instinctively protect ourselves around males in our lives. This takes a toll on us and fundamentally shapes how we develop. The patriarchy trains young girls to be like sheep following the herd. We are the original lost sheep searching for our shepherds who, we are told, are either God, our father, or our future husband. Like any flock, we follow well. We know the key ingredient of a good sheep is the ability to lose our unique identity, blend into the crowd, and become servile and passive. To shine out is unacceptable and against the rules of the flock. Being modest and dimming ourselves so that we fit in is essential. We learn early to disappear, becoming so invisible that we merge with the fog that is surrounding us. I see many women who constantly make excuses for our ill treatment at the hands of the modern day patriarchy. Our habit, our automatic default is to think something is our fault, just as a child believes it's their fault when they receive a parent's neglect or ill treatment. This is why many of us don't call out toxic treatment. We don't even believe it's an option. So part and parcel of our daily experience is bad treatment, as we watch our mothers and sisters endure it all around us. We grow up believing this is simply the way things are. This book challenges us to push against the status quo. It dares us to go beyond how things are to enter a new vision of ourselves. It begins by awakening us to our reality, how our biology shapes us, how our psychology molds us, and how our culture scares us until we lose ourselves. By understanding and embracing these three layers, we allow ourselves to break free. The first step begins in calling the fog a fog, distinguishing it from reality. In my own life, it took decades to actually name what I was going through. I so lived in fear of disapproval of others that in order to keep the harmony, I took on the blame for what I was enduring. If anyone behaved badly, it was because of something I did. I thought this was how I was supposed to take responsibility. Little did I know that all I was doing was deflecting the other from taking responsibility. By my taking the blame, the other could stay comfortable and therefore happy with me. It took me a long time to realize the difference between taking on blame versus taking on responsibility. Whereas blaming myself kept me mired in fear, accompanied by my silence and complicity, taking responsibility allowed me to see my participation in my own victimization and rise up with courage and daring. Fear is the ruling emotion in our fogged up state. Because we live in fear, we don't call out the toxicity for what it is. Fear is followed by blame, topped off by shame for feeling such fears and not taking action against them. I saw this cycle of fear, blame, shame in my own life. Each time I didn't stand up for myself out of fear, I beat myself up for days afterward. It was only when I could own my fear that I began to awaken. There are two arrows, you see. One is the actual denigration and silence we women endure. The second is the blame, shame we feel for having endured it. Deep down, we know we should speak up fearlessly. Our fear revolves around the following: what will people say? Who will I be without external approval? Will speaking up affect me financially? Will my children be okay? Will I face emotional or physical harm? Not only do we stay afraid, we can't help feeling nauseated by our lack of courage. Cycling between these fears keeps our own internal subjugation alive and kicking. Eventually, we realize that we have no name to tame it. We become ready to shout from the rooftops, "Me too!" Instead of drowning in victimhood, we end what kept us in such a subjugated state. I understand when women are pissed off, outraged, frustrated. They have suppressed their feelings for so long that it makes sense when they bubble over and feel the need to scream no more. Such women are often labeled irrational, emotional, and off the rails. They're likely to be socially ostracized. Scared that this might happen to us, we tend to avoid becoming so bold. Little do we realize that becoming a bold woman is our path to salvation. As long as fear eclipses the language of our soul, we continue to be puppets of external forces. Under the tutelage of fear, our ego performs like an automation. Robotically reactive, we become a slave to fear in its many forms: fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of ostracism, fear of loneliness, fear of unworthiness, fear of emotional or physical abuse. So conditioned are we to be afraid with fear like a second skin. So pervasive is fear in our life experiences, we often fail to fully appreciate just how ruled by it we are. Because of our place in the patriarchy, we women allow ourselves to be silenced and bullied for fear of punishment by the often more powerful males in our life. Over time, this silent cowering becomes our internal default. It's often so subtle, we can barely discern it in ourselves. Whether we are in a toxic relationship or not, or have been physically abused or not, the fact that we are a hair's breadth away from this possibility, don't be fooled into thinking you're smarter or wiser just because you haven't fallen prey to an aspect of our patriarchy in a direct way. It's actually unavoidable. If you're a woman in today's world, you have felt it in some way or another. You may not recognize these experiences for what they actually were yet, but they happened, and trust me, they had an impact. There isn't a woman I know who has escaped the crushing weight of the patriarchy in which we live. It took me years into my journey to accept how much I had allowed my own worth and voice to be crushed by the men around me. I'm most ashamed to admit that I was so blind and conditioned as to allow myself to be silenced in the ways I did most of my life. I almost don't want you to know this side of me. I want you to project an aura of perfection, wisdom, and power onto me. Yet I also know that it's only when I lay bare the honest truth about my own awakening process that you may be able to begin yours. It's always so much easier to hide our vulnerable sides, the parts of us that aren't so wise, aren't so bold, or so put together. Yet I know now that it's only when women share their processes, their true processes, the bare bones of them, that other women can feel safe to share theirs. It's in the sharing that we can collectively rise. Leaning into the discomfort of revealing parts of ourselves we don't want to acknowledge and certainly don't want others to see is a crucial part of our healing journey. Unless we stare at ourselves and acknowledge all our inner parts, we will not enter wholeness. To integrate ourselves means to accept all of who we are, the done and the undone, the kind and the unkind, the strong and the not strong. Wholeness doesn't mean perfection, it means acceptance. A raw and unabashed acceptance of exactly who we are in any given moment. Just to recap, we are reading A Radical Awakening by Dr. Shefali Tsabry on chapter 1, The Matrix. Sharing my life story in these pages has been an act of leaning into discomfort. At times, I resisted it out of fear of your disapproval, yet I knew that I had to walk through these fears. If I didn't, I wouldn't share, and if I didn't share, I wouldn't grow. If I didn't grow, neither would you. This discomfort is not only natural, it's the only way we shed the familiar and enter the new. We have been conditioned to run from discomfort. Yet I wish for these pages to show you that it's only when we run toward these shadowy places within ourselves that we find our redemption, our truth, and our freedom. Hitting rock bottom. I know I'm not alone on this quest for my true self. I've talked with thousands of women who want to get out of the fog and live more awakened lives. So oblivious are we that we are living from a false sense of ourselves, fear, ridden, and suppressed, that it often requires multiple awakenings for us to face up to the facts. I think back to my client, Pam. She called me after a particularly harrowing day. She had spent the entire day tending to her family. She went through a litany of things she'd done for each of them. Her elderly mother needed to be driven to the doctor. Her ailing sister needed her home care help arranged. Her daughter needed help moving furniture in her apartment. Her youngest son needed help with homework. Her husband needed her to input on a project he was working on. Loving and kind, Pam thought that putting their needs before her own was what she was supposed to do. She had done this all her life and kept playing this self-sacrificing role. What Pam wasn't in touch with was the emotional toll it was having on her. She wasn't connecting the dots. She had put on 27 pounds in the last year. Her husband had come close to divorce after she discovered his infidelity. She regularly lost her temper with her children. Instead of being in touch with her true feelings, she kept covering them up through the role she was so desperately holding on to, believing it would deliver her emotional salvation she craved. She was acting out her conditioned concepts of the kind of mother, wife, and daughter she believed she needed to be in order to be validated. And it was killing her. She just didn't know it. She was completely submerged in the fog. When I gently suggested she was playing the role of rescuer and fixer in order to get her needs met, she retorted indignantly, "Are you suggesting I want to do this?" She could hardly believe I would imply such a thing. "Why would I do that?" she insisted. "Why would I willingly exhaust myself like this? Am I just a sucker for punishment?" It took us a while to deconstruct her pattern so she could finally see how she had been playing roles of fixer, giver, and rescuer, even without realizing it. Pam had always been the savior in her family, the solution finder, the nurse, the mediator, the peacemaker. Where there was a need, she was the provider. This is how she had acquired her parents' love as a child. Whenever others in her life had a need, instead of allowing them to take care of themselves, she rushed to the rescue. When it came to loving another or receiving love, this was the only method she knew. It was quite possible she even attracted needy people so she can play out her familiar role. Over time, not knowing how to take care of herself through proper boundaries, she reached a breaking point. Women are trained by culture to receive love through sacrificing ourselves. Such self sacrifice takes on a myriad of appearances. Regardless of what they are, we believe that through their embodiment, we will receive love we desperately seek from our immediate families. This behavior slowly branches out to our friends and others. If our self sacrificing roles keep bringing us attention, and it doesn't really matter whether this attention is positive or negative, we adopt them. Soon, we cannot tell if the roles are even roles or if they are our true selves. Little by little, just like Pam, we begin to melt down, either through exhaustion or as a result of a crisis. All veneer cracks and light begins to enter through tiny crevices. The arrival of light, where there was only a shadow before, feels traumatic. As we are stripped of our roles for the first time, perhaps we feel bereft on one hand and strangely alive on the other. These feelings are so shocking, our instinct is to cover the crevices back with old patterns and forget what we glimpsed. The ego can no longer cover up the cracks. When this happens, we frequently refer to it as a breakdown. If it occurs later in life, we call it a midlife crisis. Typically, only excessive trauma can shake the ego off its axis. When this happens, we may hit rock bottom. As a therapist, rock bottom is the experience I wait for in a client. It signifies the potential death of the ego. Whereas the client avoids it desperately, trying every which way to bypass its final reckoning, the therapist waits for its bated breath. At rock bottom, the real self is forced to strip off its mask, often leaving the person feeling like a stranger to themselves. There is a sense that nothing works anymore. All our tried and true strategies that we used to run from the truth of who we are now seeming to fail. The day my car swerved off the road was my rock bottom. It was at that moment I realized I needed to make changes right away. I didn't know where to begin or how. All I knew that it was time. My soul could not stand to be eroded any further. When we reach rock bottom, the silent denigration we allow at the hands of culture or our parents must be fully acknowledged and repaired. The hard part is seeing this allowing part of ourselves naked in the mirror. It's almost too unbearable to accept that we have let ourselves to be thoroughly neglected and belittled. What now? Should we go back to being who we were raised to be? Can we really return to living in a fog, a cloudy haze of fair rituals, traditions, and the conveyor belt of predictability? If we are truly at rock bottom, the choice is often made for us. We can keep pretending it isn't, but it is. Our minds can make up all sorts of fantasies, tricking us into believing that everything is the same as before, but deep down, we know we are avoiding the stark truth. The reason why rock bottom hurts so much is because our ego's facade has cracked under the pressure. Our usual habits and strategies no longer work, they have bottomed out. We now feel emotionally bereft. This new place feels scary and threatening. Who are we without our usual egoic defenses? If only we realize that hitting rock bottom and undergoing the cracking of our ego is a portal to our rebirth, we wouldn't dread it so much. Because we don't trust this is all happening for our own betterment, we resist it. This is understandable. Without our childhood scripts and patterns and minus culture's impositions, who we are. Have we ever examined who we might be when stripped of our facade? If we are courageous enough to see the answer, we are on track to find the true purpose of our lives. To be our most authentic self in the here and now. This means digging deep into our essence and shedding all that isn't true to who we are. It means releasing the parts of being that no longer serve us and letting go of patterns that keep us stuck. It means looking squarely at our fear of doing so and confronting what lies behind it. For Pam, it meant shedding her need to be validated as a rescuer and a fixer. As she increasingly validated her inner self, she released those around her from giving her that ego fix. As she grew to love herself more, she began to say no more often. At first, those close to her resisted her new way of being and even felt betrayed by her, which is the normal reaction. When they realized they had no choice, they began falling in line. Pam had left the light. She had finally tasted what it meant to be free of the script that she needed to sacrifice herself in order to receive another's validation. She was unable to answer the question all of us arrive at on our path towards spiritual awakening. Am I ready to be true to myself and give myself the validation I so desperately sought from others until now? So that's page 16, and I'm going to stay here right now. I don't know if there is any discussion, or I can just go on to the final section from fear to love. So we can go into chapter 2 next week, right? So I'm just going to continue the chapter from fear to love. How did we learn to stay silent in the face of fear? It's like we instinctively knew from childhood that it was wiser to remain silent than to protest. When I got groped on the bus, catcalled on the street, harassed in the store, or straight up abused by this man or that, I learned to swallow my dignity. I was always afraid to face retribution if I made too much noise. I was more attached to how others saw me than I was being authentic. Every abused woman will attest to this. We all stay quiet because we are afraid that speaking up will cause others to disapprove of us, making things worse. Cultural oppression and subjugation are the masters of our psyche, and fear is the curriculum they meet out on a daily basis. We are graded on how silent and subservient we are. The more quiet, the higher the grade. These are the legacies of a patriarchal culture that has everyone messed up, including men. Such is the nature of a toxic system. It doesn't spare anyone from its clutches. When we enter fear and its offspring, silence, we move away from self-love. One of the hallmarks of self-love is the honor and free expression of our inner worlds without blame or shame. Constant suppression of our authentic voice creates annoying and growing inner disconnect. By pushing away and ignoring our authentic experiences, we promote the illusion they didn't even occur. This disassociation provides fleeting comfort, but over time, it causes us to lose touch with our moment-by-moment experiences. The greater the disassociation, the greater the lack of inner connection and alignment. Soon what we say, think, and do are grossly out of touch, leaving us feeling anxious and bereft. When we give in to culture's manipulation, playing safe and playing small, the patriarchy stays in the power. The antidote to cultural suppression is a daring rebellion against silence. There is no nobility in suppressing and abnegating our voice. Such oppression doesn't do anyone any good. It simply encourages and upholds the dominance of the patriarchy. In most of the adult intimate relationships I've had with men, I stayed in fear. Bold and daring in my career, I was the opposite in my personal interactions. I was inauthentic and allowed myself to fade into oblivion. It took me years to fully awaken. One denigration from another, one suppression from another, one more moment of denying my inner truth was slowly building up pressure. I pretended nothing was going on until one day I couldn't anymore. Then everything blew to smithereens. I can write this book on a radical awakening because I have walked the path of hot coals myself. I lived so many years being false to myself that I understand that what it takes to get out of the fog. My goal is not to focus on the pain as much as to show women it's possible to transform into your power. We don't want to see how burying our truth is an act of war against ourselves, but it very much is. Unless we recognize this, we will keep doing it to ourselves. When we allow toxicity to exist for the sake of keeping the peace, we are actually perpetuating war. There is no peace where there is no authenticity. Lasting peace only emerges from an honest acceptance of oneself and one's life experiences. Self love blossoms when we claim our experiences through our expressions and our actions. Each time we honor our feelings and in a process we declare self love. When we rebel against culture's embargo against our voice, we give ourselves and each other the space to be heard and seen. Imagine if women everywhere began to speak their authentic truth about how it really feels to be who they are, including their fears and failures. Can you imagine the release of pressure we would feel? We would no longer need to walk around feeling cloistered and suffocated, pretending to live perfect lives. We would set ourselves and each other free. When a woman tells the daring truth of what she has endured, she moves from being mired in individual fear towards new emotion, love. She declares, I love myself, I'm worthy of being heard, I am more than the sum of my past, I trust my voice. In this book, I challenge women to shift from fear to love. When we tell our stories and feel witnessed, we experience an integration within ourselves. Soon there's a growing coherence and a growing wholeness within us that might not have been there before. When one woman manifests the courage to speak up for herself like the tidal wave, she declares a path for other women to empower and emancipate themselves. When she begins to live in authenticity, others are emboldened to do the same. The focus shifts from her fear for her own well being to love for all. She understands that by ending her own fear, she's actually loving herself, her sisters, and her daughters. As we begin to notice how we participate in our own self suppression, we can take small steps towards self expression. It may take time because we are unaccustomed to hearing ourselves speak our truth, but we can begin with a close friend or a maternal figure, perhaps. Or we can enter coaching or therapy to work with a relative, a stranger. As we do so, we consciously manifest who we are, truly are, rather than being unconscious and passive victims. Awareness of how culture has oppressed and suppressed and silenced us allows us to understand our psyche better. This awareness is not passive. It requires careful scrutiny of our internal dynamics and how they have been set up by our conditioning. Through this active process of deconstruction and discernment, awareness moves into awakening. As you read these words, you may feel intimidated or overwhelmed. You may feel inadequate in some way. If you do, I am here to assuage those emotions by telling you that there is no perfect way to awaken. It's not about getting to a destination either. It is, quite simply, just about your unfolding. An unfolding that will occur naturally as you allow these words to enter you. This is a way of consciousness. It is akin to light bulbs getting turned on in an otherwise dark room. These words are your light bulbs. As they turn on, you will begin to see what was previously and is in the shadows. Once the light is on, you cannot help but see it's a natural outcome of your new consciousness. You are here. This is huge. Let's take a deep breath and move on to the next chapter together. So we will move on to the next chapter next week, which is the idea of that woman. Thank you, Michelle Thorne, for showing interest. I appreciate you asking. Now, first chapter. The first chapter's name is Asleep in the Matrix, where she basically, that's the first part. Soul Erosion is the first chapter, where she basically explained that from a very young age, women are being brainwashed by their culture, by their loved ones, that we have to be submissive. And the submissive woman is the woman who gets everything. She's the one who is seen as most self-sacrificing, most loving, most giving. She is the savior. She is the answer to everybody's prayers, but her own. When I read this first chapter, at that time, I was feeling overwhelmed as well with the amount of work that I had to do at my job. It was quite a bit of work. It was during the COVID-19 pandemic, and everybody just expected me to go above and beyond because that's kind of like what I was expected to do. But at that same time, I had a couple health scares. So in having those health scares and realizing that work will be replaced by somebody else tomorrow, but I need to take better care of my health in order so that I can be around, because the only job that I will not be replaced in is a mother. My children are not going to find another mother to be their mother. There is only one mother. My husband can find another wife. My staff can find other teachers. Like, it just made me realize that all of this importance that I place on myself, the self-importance, all of that importance that I place on myself really and truly is not important. And I needed to question myself, like take responsibility for myself. Like, why is it that always being the person who does this, the person who can achieve this, the helper, why is it that I always feel more obligated to those roles than me, right? Me exercising, me meal prepping, me reading a book. Why is it that is seen as more acceptable than reading a book and so on? So as I read on, which is in the second chapter, that was really when I started putting things into perspective, because I'm saying, this is why my mother died. This is exactly why my mother died. My mother died because she had to be everything for everybody except herself. And then the fear of dying, the way my mom died, kind of crept in. That fear of reliving that story where she passed away and it's like her presence is so deeply missed. And I know it's not because people miss her laugh or they miss her smile. It's because they miss the service. They miss the service that she did for them. And I didn't want to be that. I didn't want that in my illness, as I am ill, going through this pandemic, that something happens to me. And the only loss that people can feel is the loss of my service, the loss of me being able to do things for them. Whether that be edit work, teach an extra class, give lessons, be involved in co-curricular activity, call and listen to their problems on the phone. Like, everything became, how does this benefit me in some way? If it's not a win-win situation where I win and you win because we both benefit from the interaction, then it's not a transaction, right? Because a transaction means that both parties have to win. And if it's a situation where I'm constantly being called upon to self sacrifice so that I can appear to be a good person, I just said, I'm not going to go out like my mother. I'm not going to do this because this is something I constantly worried about. Like, why does she do all of this when she should be resting? And I understand why. Whereas I wouldn't go above and beyond for like a co-worker, I would go above and beyond at my work so that I will be seen as most competent, most whatever. And I just had to take responsibility that the disrespect that I endure because I don't want to say something because the person who I may say it to may be friends with somebody who may block a promotion or all of those little tactics that you rationalize in your brain. Those tactics only seem right because we have so many different things working in our head, like our fathers, our mothers, our culture. All of those things are just leading us right back to being a good, quiet woman. So, in reading the book, I realized that my mother failed to take responsibility for her actions and she's not here anymore. I have the opportunity to take responsibility for my actions right now, and that's what I'm doing. So, yeah, a lot of changes came as we go on in the book. I'll talk about the different changes, but understanding that not everybody who claims to be a friend is actually there to be friendly, right? Some people are looking for higher, higher self. Everybody is looking for higher self. Everybody is searching for higher being. Everybody is looking for who can I become? Who am I? But you cannot look at higher self until we find ourselves at rock bottom. At rock bottom, we have to take off all of that. We have to take off all of that facade. We have to take off all of that conditioning, all of that brainwashing before we can really emerge authentic, because then we're just putting on another mask. We're just letting our ego create and curate another version of ourselves that's just as detrimental, just as fake, just as inauthentic. So yeah, that's what I got. I had to ask myself, what are these interactions bringing for me? If these interactions are not bringing me some joy, some satisfaction, like it's not for me. It's not for me. And providing service for people who really don't care how their requests are affecting me, affecting my life, affecting my time, my energies, my emotion, then I should not be more concerned about what you need than what I need. So I just started asking myself, what do I need? If I need time, I had to tell somebody no. I had to say no to somebody. If I need space, I need to tell somebody, you know, keep the distance. If I needed rest, I needed to tell people, don't contact me. And obviously those things shook a lot of people, but I was more committed to being true to myself than being nice and of service to somebody else who does not care about me genuinely. Yeah. So that's how I stopped the erosion of my soul, having read the first chapter of this book. I wish more people were here for the discussion. I wish more people were here for the actual reading, but this is just the first reading and I'm going to post the recording. So if you have any comments, go ahead and leave the comments in the comment section. Questions, leave them in the comment section. Like the video, share the video, and meet me next week for another virtual book club reading the first book, A Radical Awakening by Dr. Shefali, Turning Your Power into Pain. Have a great Wednesday night and an awesome Thursday and Friday and weekend. Thank you for tuning in.